Thank you, colleagues, and thank you, everybody, for being here. At the risk of telling most of you things you may already know, I do think it's worth making sure that we're all on the same page about some foundational parts of the expungement process, and everybody understands what happens in this process. So let me take a step back and just tell you about my background here. So I was a practitioner and helped people get expungements for about 19 years. And in my office, the one thing I had to teach the person who answered the phone in my office was how to screen for expungements, because 90% of the people who called my office were not eligible. And you get about 2 questions into the phone call, and you'd realize that if they had 2 misdemeanors, or if they had 3 misdemeanors, they were out of luck. Back when I started, you can only have 1 anything. And we've expanded from an incredibly restrictive expungement eligibility to a very restrictive expungement eligibility. Right now in Michigan, if you have 3 misdemeanor convictions, you are out of luck. You cannot get your record cleaned up. If you have 2 felonies, you are out of luck. Doesn't matter whether you're an 85-year-old grandmother. You can't get that. You can't get your record cleaned up. And so almost everybody who called my office was not eligible, something like 90%. Let's say you were one of the lucky 10% that were eligible. Then the question boiled down to, do you have $1,500? Because that's how much it costs to have me go through an expungement process with you, because the petition process involves doing a bunch of investigation, figuring out whether your client is eligible, then going in front of a judge, putting your client up on the stand, taking testimony, asking them questions before the judge made a decision. That takes time, and time is money if you're a lawyer. So we had a very narrow door and then a very costly process if you were even eligible to go through that door. And as we all know, because I've talked with you all about this ad nauseum in the bail context, half this country doesn't have $500 or nowhere to get $500 if they had a $500 problem. So asking folks in that situation in their life to come up with $1,500 means you're telling them no. So that's an access to justice problem, and that's something that deeply concerns me, is that we have a system in Michigan which is equally accessible to the affluent and the non-affluent, that we don't have a 2-track system for where people who have money get massively different results than people who don't have money. And that's why my colleague Representative Leutheiser's bill is so incredibly important, because the concept that we could start doing things automatically is a game changer for people who don't have money. Now, recently we started opening the door a little bit more on people who don't have money. So there are expungement clinics and things like that. But the reality is, and you're going to hear from some other people on this, of the people who are eligible in Michigan right now to get expungements, only 6% of them do. And there are some reasons for that: shame, maybe, not wanting to go to court, but a lot of it's got to do with whether or not they have the money. So lack of money, lack of understanding that you can get your record expunged, and shame are all things that are going to stop it happening when it otherwise should happen. And that's why the automatic mechanism is so important. Now, the other thing that I want to really point out here is you're going to have a lot of people, I suspect, come up and talk about how this is going to be transformative for job opportunities and housing opportunities, and that is absolutely the case. However, as I work in the criminal justice space, what my first question always about any policy is, are we going to be increasing or reducing public safety? If we're reducing public safety, I'm out. If we're increasing public safety, then you've got my attention. Think for a moment about one of the most effective ways to lower somebody's recidivism risk is to give them something to lose. So if somebody has housing, if they have a job, they are less likely to reoffend than if they don't. Our current expungement mechanism throws huge barriers in the ways of people who have been crime-free for a long time, but don't have a job and potentially don't have housing. If we can open the door for people to get those things, we are narrowing the risk that they're going to reoffend. And so the thing that I find most exciting about this package is that I believe, and I'm firmly convinced, and all the data and all the studies show, that what we are trying to do here, make expungement available to a whole lot more people, is going to increase public safety in the state of Michigan. Now, it's also nice that people will get jobs. That's really important. It's also nice that people will get housing. That's really important. But public safety is what anybody in this space should always be keeping their eye on. The other thing that I want to just say some things that I hope everyone understands. One is that there are two parts to this process, the package we're talking about. One is, how wide is the door? That's expansion of eligibility. That's what the bill that that's the part of the package that my bill focuses on. And on that question, please everybody remember that when we're talking about expanding eligibility, we're talking about going in front of a judge and letting them use their brain to determine whether to say yes or no. So when you're talking about expanding eligibility, you're quite appropriately talking about a broader range of possibilities than you are with automatic. With automatic, you quite appropriately want to have a smaller door, because automatic means there's not a judge looking at the case. These are things where you can say, look, it is perfectly rational, we can let a robot do that. And so automatic expungement means writing code so that specific parts of the Michigan criminal code, if they're on your criminal history, fall off your criminal history after a certain amount of time. So we want to be careful about that. The other thing that's also worth remembering is there is a big, broad category of, let's call them scary crimes, which are not eligible for expungement. This package does not contemplate making any of those currently non-expungible bills crimes expungible. The big exception to that, and it's not an exception to the scary idea, but we do have a new category of crimes that we're contemplating making expungible. Those are traffic offenses. And even those are narrowed somewhat, because there are some traffic offenses that we don't want to let you have expunged because they're indicative of danger. So for example, if you flee the scene of an accident, anybody who's a practitioner knows that often people who flee the scene are fleeing the scene because they're drunk and they didn't want to get caught. Or they had maybe they had a warrant for a bank robbery in Nebraska and they didn't want to get caught. But that's a flag. That's a different problem than, say, driving on an expired plate, or driving on a suspended license, or not having your driver's license with you when you get pulled over by the police. So we do intend to open the door for those offenses. The other thing that's really important for all of us to remember as we think about this is, and I want to highlight, before they get up here, I even want to compliment, we got two rock stars in the audience here from University of Michigan, Sonia Starr and J.J. Prescott. And we have the simple good fortune that these two academics are in the state of Michigan and looked at a whole bunch of data about the state of Michigan. So all of their research is not based on looking at Nebraska and saying, well, Michigan's probably kind of like Nebraska, so, we can analogize. They looked at a whole bunch of data on what happens to people in the state of Michigan. And Professors Starr and Prescott came into a presentation on this, and my favorite slide of theirs maybe was putting somebody through the Michigan Works program has an equal effect on positive outcomes for their life as cleaning up their criminal history. You clean up someone's criminal history, and overnight there's this jump in employability and there's a jump in income statistically. So we have the opportunity to do something with all of us in government should love things that have good outcomes with very little cost, right? Like, we pay a lot of money for Michigan Works. We don't have to pay a lot of money to clean somebody's record up. So we have this huge opportunity to massively improve the quality of lives of probably hundreds of thousands of Michigan residents. The other thing that and at the risk of pointing out the obvious, I want us all to remember, when we're talking about expungement, we're not talking about making information unavailable to law enforcement. If you have a conviction of something, that information is always going to be available to the police officer who pulls you over, to the prosecutor that's looking over whatever new problem you've got in your life. What we're talking about is not having that information available to employers and landlords. And a reasonable person might ask why my landlord needs to know how many times I jaywalked when I was 18. If I haven't had any contact with the police in 5 years, how does that affect my ability to be a good tenant, right? If you're a landlord, you should be worried about whether or not I'm going to pay my bills and whether I'm going to trash my apartment. And those are things that, that's what a lease application is supposed to screen for. So our hope here is then to make some really positive changes. And I just wanted to point out all of those framing issues so we know what we're talking about. I do want to point out that I believe that there's more work that we need to do as a committee to make these bills better. And I want to flag a few things here before I stop. The first is in my bill, and oddly enough, I'm going to tell you an edit for my bill. If you look at my expansion bill, right now there's a framing in there that sort of tries to focus on bad people rather than on limiting crimes. And I generally don't like analyses that puts people into a bad person box. So as written, my bill says if you commit any assault of crime, then you're in this separate category. And everybody else can have up to 3 felonies expunged and unlimited misdemeanors. I would suggest that a better way to do this is to say, well, if you're worried about assault of crimes, limit the number of assault of crimes you can get expunged off your record. But don't let that affect how many misdemeanors you can get off your record. An assault of crime logically doesn't really relate to a bad check problem or jaywalking. So I think that framework has to be shifted into my bill, and we have to focus on limiting crimes, not taking people who have committed a crimes and limiting their opportunities. In my colleague, Representative Lloydhouse's bill, there's what I thought was first a typo, and that is it says that there should be either 2 felonies or 4 misdemeanors automatically expunged. I don't think that makes sense. That should be an and, because otherwise you wind up with weird problems where you can't even game out, like what if you had 1 felony and 1 misdemeanor? Like how would that play out with that language drafted that way? So I think that needs to be fixed. The other thing that I think we all need to think about is the timing of when we start the clock. And specifically here, when do we start the clock on what we mean by you haven't committed any offenses? Back in 2011, I think, we used to say that we started the clock on what we're calling crime-free from when you're either released from jail or prison or when you were convicted. So if you're convicted and you don't get any time, we start the clock then. If you're released, we start the clock then, which makes perfect sense. Since then, we've added, and this bill would add two new criteria. One is if you're on parole, we don't count any day you're on parole as a day that you're crime-free, which to me is a little odd, but we'll let that go. The other is any day you're on probation. Now, felony probation, I can see a case for waiting till you're off felony probation. Counting your misdemeanor probation time against your time that you're not really free from criminal activity is problematic for 2 reasons. One is it gives you bad policy outcomes. The other is it's not enforceable. The reason it's not enforceable is because we don't have data from every individual district court about when they're actually letting people off probation. So if you're going to a court and trying to petition or even get things off automatically, using a data set that we don't know is a bad idea. The second problem is, the public policy problem is this. Let's say, Representative Lefebvre, can I use you in a hypothetical? Okay. I always try to make myself the bad.
Hey, David, we just want to make sure we keep moving.
I understand, but this is an important point, Chairman, so let me make this point and then I'll stop. If you steal a candy bar from a gas station and you have no criminal history, and the judge says, okay, I really want to scare Bo Lefebvre, I'm going to put him on 2 years of non-reporting probation, and I'm going to give him a $100 fine. You're on probation for 2 years. I, on the other hand, do something really bad that's a misdemeanor, and the judge throws the book at me. He gives me 90 days in jail, but he can't give me any probation because he gave me 90 days in jail. I get my much worse thing. I'm eligible for expungement 2 years before you're eligible for expungement. So that's why I think using misdemeanor probation as a trigger is a bad idea. In close, though, let me just say, again, this is something that I think is going to make Michigan safer. It's going to allow huge amounts of opportunities for a lot of people who are shut out of access to opportunity. So I think this is a great initiative, and I certainly hope that we can move forward and go proselytize on this after today.